name is, as Sarah mentioned, my name is Coreen Weilminster, and I work with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, which is part of my specific division is the Chesapeake and Coastal Services Division. And the work that I specifically do is as education coordinator for the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Maryland. And in Chesapeake Bay, we have two research reserves. We have a Virginia and a Maryland reserve, both of which are part of a network of research reserves all around the country, 29 total right now, and several that are hopeful in the planning stages for other estuaries around our great nation. And so we do a lot of research around estuaries and then education with that science. And then in addition to the education we do from that science we gather, we also have management and training that is done at the local and state levels around estuaries. But for me, one of the biggest journeys I've been on in this job is in learning how to talk about climate change, particularly in my work with building resilient coastal communities and the work that I do. And so I've gone through a couple of different trainings, I've learned a few things, and I'm going to share what I've learned with you along the way. And hopefully it will give you a little bit of confidence if you are a little nervous to have conversations about climate. I'll share with you what builds confidence for me with that. So let's see. Oh no, why is it not advancing? There we go. Oh, it's just a click of the mouse. Okay, as I mentioned, education coordinator with Maryland Department of Natural Resources and the National Estuarine Research Reserve. I also like to stipulate that I am an educator. I am not a scientist, but I do science communication, which is a little bit different than actually doing science. To give you guys all a little bit of an idea of some of the more, I guess, succinct lessons that I've learned, and I hope that at the end of this presentation, you'll understand or see some of the really great things that are happening around this issue. And for one thing, we all need to realize that we're really in a good place. I know climate change is one of the kind of defining issues of our times, and it doesn't feel like we're in a good place. But I'm going to tell you why we're in a good place to have productive conversations around the issue. I also want you to feel secure. You don't have to be a scientist. I'm not. You don't even have to know all of the climate science. I think there's a lot to be said for knowing the difference between certain aspects of the science and being able to communicate about it in a meaningful way. So we're going to talk a little bit about which pieces of the science I feel are more critical in having those productive conversations. I think it's really important too to understand your role in your community as a trusted messenger. And as a trusted messenger, there are some ways that we can have more meaningful conversations and to frame the conversation in a way that allows for discussion about solutions and discussions that provide agency and a sense of hope. So I'm from Maryland, and I'm going to talk about what Maryland is doing. It's part of your neighboring area for Virginia and the DC region. But I encourage you to also check and see what your state is doing and what the district is doing as well. So, okay, we're in a good place. And the first thing I'd like to bring up is in having conversations that are productive around climate change. I mean, with any conversation or with any kind of presentation, it's helpful to know your audience. And one of the really great resources that I find in familiarizing myself with is something called the Six Americas Study, which is done through the Yale School of Climate Communication. And basically what they found over the last several years is that Americans fall into 6 categories. So we're either an alarmed American, a concerned American, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive American. What this looks like on a scale, and I'm going to show you some different years of data. So this is a bunch of data that was released in November of 2016. Why this is a good place to have a conversation. And that is because the majority of Americans, even back in 4 years ago, were 75% of us we're in an area that is ripe for talking about solutions, right? 75% of us were already thinking about it and ready to start thinking about solutions or acting on this. And so you have a great idea data-wise, thinking about who you're talking to, that there's a 75% chance that that person is in one of these three categories and would be willing to have those productive conversations. What I like though is as the years go by and as this survey gets done annually, we do see how those pools of American beliefs kind of change. And so in 2016, we were at 75%, but then by 2018, we had had a little bit of an increase in the disengaged and doubtful. And I just wanted to kind of challenge all of you out there to think about what happened between 2016 and 2018. And Sarah, I'll let you suggest what's in the chat box if anybody is willing to throw some things into the chat. Since I can't see it.
So far, we're just waiting for the answers to get here.
Well,
Charlotte says Trump, Natalie, 2016 election.
Those are both the answers I was looking for. Yeah, so change of administration. And so, you know, these are types of things that can really affect, as Americans, how we think about and, you know, surround ourselves with information about an issue. And so we see the impact of it even here a little bit with respect to these different beliefs. Now, something else happened between 2018 and 2019, and I guess I should say maybe someone else happened, and we saw a big shift in the alarmed category. We went from 21 to 31%. It was the highest that the alarmed category ever was. So I'm going to throw that back out to the participants here and see if they know who happened in American culture or even global culture. I'll give you a hint, she has pigtails.
Greta, says Natalie.
Yes, Greta Thunberg, right? And we did see, because of the stage, very, very international, very big stage that she was on, that it had some influence in how we kind of viewed this issue and how concerned we were for it. And if you think about it, she calls it a climate crisis. So going from, you know, 21% of alarmed people to 31% can sort of show you how we can shift our beliefs based on even how people who have a stage to be able to talk about this frame their conversations. Now, I'm just sharing this slide with you because I'm a big fan of using art in climate change. And while I haven't incorporated that aspect too much in this presentation, I wanted to pull out a resource for all of you, something called Grumpy Uncle and Climate Change. It's a great book and it's a great website that's coming out. And it's basically one of the scientists who works in the Yale School of Climate Communication has found ways to illustrate some of these various beliefs. And it's wonderful and it's very enlightening. And I would highly encourage everybody to go out there and look at that. All right, we're going to move on. One of the other things that comes out of the climate school, the Yale School of Climate Communication, is the climate opinion maps, which if you ever have a moment where you're just curious to see what things are like in your region, I highly recommend that you go to climatecommunication.yale.edu and you look for this opinion map. And they are hot off the presses for 2020. They came out, I think, about on the 2nd of September, which is really exciting. But you can break down the data nationally, at the state level, congressional districts. You can look at metro areas or counties. And then at the very top, the fields you can select there are the different questions that they polled Americans in. And also, you can look at the values in different metrics as well. For this presentation, though, I'm looking at our national averages and compared to the state of Maryland, again, which is kind of regional to where we are. And nationally, if you look at the question is, this is the estimated percent of adults who think that global warming is happening. So this is a different question than the 6 America study, different people polled, very similar numbers, but not exact. So just to clarify the difference in some of these percents that you might be seeing right now. And what's kind of cool about that is that if you then look at a state and break it down and you ask the same question, you can see where you stand in your own state. So here where I live in Maryland, global warming, 78% of Marylanders believe that global warming is happening. That's a pretty high percentage. And I feel pretty confident going out there and having a conversation in my professional world, knowing that about 78% of the people I'm going to be talking to will be okay with having this conversation. And so where we start to see differences in where beliefs break down a little bit is kind of in that realm of human activity. So what's causing climate change? And we see that in the United States, about 57% of Americans think that it's us. It's a little bit of a higher percentage in Maryland, which is also still a productive place to have a really good conversation. That being said, this should not deter you from having conversations, because when we do a little more digging, we look at, there's our 78%, sorry about that, that extra slide in there. What am I looking at here? Oh, I'm going backwards. Oh, heaven's sakes. Okay, my apologies, everyone. There we go. The estimated number who support funding into renewable research. And this is, again, not worrying about how we believe this is happening, but worrying that people are thinking about solutions or open to solutions or open to talking about things. These are more productive places. So in losing confidence or worrying about whether people believe it's us or it's natural or whatever, we shouldn't even take that very much into consideration ultimately, because when it comes down to it, one of the really beautiful things that we can all agree on, or 86% of us can agree on at least, and 89% of us in Maryland, is that we really should be funding research into renewable energy sources. So this is pretty powerful, and we should take confidence in knowing that we can have conversations around solutions, which is what we should be doing right now. Okay, so one other group that I'm going to get into here is a group called Eco America. They're fantastic in framing climate conversations around various issues. So issues related to health, or how to talk to faith-based groups around climate. And so I highly recommend ecoamerica.org as another resource for looking at great ways to have conversations around solutions that engage various communities at different levels. And so this particular slide I pulled in because this talks about urgency and agency. And these are important too to kind of understand in when we're building confidence around talking about climate change. So first we'll look at urgency. And I'd like to point out that we have two different bar graphs under urgency, also in agency. They are the I graph and the we graph. So this is important because what I've learned on my journey in climate communication is that taking an individual stance against this is important, but what we really need is collective action. And we need the we more so than the I. So what we're seeing here in the way that Eco America is looking at American and national respondents is that there's agreement on the urgency to act at a collective level. That's a really important thing, and it's really critical in understanding how we should be able to confidently have conversations. Now, can we actually act on climate? Well, let's talk about agency. And when these individuals were polled, 1,000 national respondents, we saw that around 70% of the people polled were in total agreement that they individually could help reduce pollution. And what we found too is that about 79% of Americans who were polled felt like the collective response to reducing pollution around climate was actually feasible. And that's the highest number in both of this urgency and agency, is the 79%. So I think that this shows where we are as a nation, that we're feeling the urgency to act, but also feeling ready to act, that we can do this. Really great places, and feeling confident and hopeful to be able to have good conversations. Okay, so yes, we should, and yes, we can have conversations about this and reduce this issue. All right, one of the things that I'd like to bring us back around on is in this idea of your voice and your role as a trusted messenger. So the Yale School, Yale program on climate change communication actually polls people on how they're getting their information. And with this particular metric and this graph, you'll notice that the number of people in the United States, about 25%, are admitting to seeing or hearing about global warming in the media at least once a week. In Maryland, it's a slightly lower number. This is kind of concerning. We have a role to all be trusted messengers, including in the media. And so there needs to be a little bit more of a unified voice sort of at the national level and within local and regional media around this. It would help elevate our own voices as we have these conversations with one another in our communities. One of the other things is how are we discussing it? And this is basically the estimated percent of adults who discuss it at least occasionally. So in the United States, it's 35%, and in Maryland, it's just a little bit larger. It's about 38%. We have a couple of reasons that we know through the same research as to why we're not really talking about it. And some of those reasons, I know this slide is really tiny, so I'm going to go through and read maybe the top 10. It never comes up. We agree. I don't know enough. I'm not interested. It's too political. Never occurred to me. I can't change anyone's mind. I avoid arguments. It won't solve it. I'm not interested. It's not important. So there's a variety of reasons, the last of which is that it's an uncomfortable topic. So what I'm seeing through all of this, and what I would encourage you to consider, is that if we're not talking about climate change, then we're really missing an opportunity to act on climate change. So from that perspective, I'm going to ask all of you in the audience to get ready to type into the chat box on two particular topics. One, what are your fears in talking about climate change? And two, I'd love if anyone is in the audience would love to share a time that they've had a hopeful conversation about it. So we'll take about 2 minutes to sort of look to see what that comes down to with all the participants today.
So the answers are starting to roll in. We
Okay.
are getting frustration with counter arguments, not being able to back up talking points with trusted data, fear, won't be able to address negative reactions, and people will show rejection of the ideas, being judged as an extremist, fear of retribution from industries that profit from not changing, leads to politics. I'm afraid it's too late. I live in West Virginia, where there is a great deal of denial, don't know enough, and it's too depressing.
Okay, thank you, Serenella. So I'll kind of work a little bit off of some of those, because I think in the journey that I've been on since around 2013, I've had to go through the gamut of all of those different concerns and fears. And certainly, you know, I know that individuals said they live in West Virginia. I grew up in literally Carbon County, Pennsylvania, where anthracite coal was king. And so going home to see my parents and having, hey, what's going on in your work world these days, kiddo, with my parents has been really an interesting opportunity to talk or not talk about climate change. And yes, your voice is your superpower. And yes, you know, getting an opportunity to sort of share that can be a challenge, even in our own families, and that fear of rejection is real. So we'll go down this road a little bit more as we're on this presentation. Are there any hopeful stories in the chat box, Darnella?
Nope, I have only received concerns until this moment.
That's okay. I'm going to tell you why, and that is because I only have hopeful conversations about climate change with my peers. Outside in my personal realm, it's a different story, and people are a little more reluctant to have those conversations. So I agree in that having those hopeful conversations can be few and far between, but that's something I'm hopeful will change today. All right, let's see. Next slide, where are we? There we go. Okay, so there's this great thing that came out of, again, that Center for Climate Change Communication and George Mason University and Yale Yale Center for Climate Change Communication. And these are 10 words that if you remember nothing else today, these are the 10 words we're hopeful that folks will start to put into their regular vocabulary. It's real. It's us. Experts agree. It's bad. And there's hope. So really, we need to establish that it's happening, that human activity is the cause. We need to just know out of the gate without a doubt and move forward confidently stating that there's scientific consensus around it. The impacts are serious and they affect a lot of the, a lot of the humans on Earth, but especially the ones that are most vulnerable, which makes it a moral issue. And we have technology right now needed to avoid some of the worst of climate impacts. We just need to get behind it and get it employed. All right, so it's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, and there's hope. All right, so here you are, all of you in the audience today. You are a superhero, and your superpower is your voice, right? Knowing that, using your voice, you should also, like I said earlier, have confidence in that you really don't have to know a whole heck of a lot about the climate science in order to have these productive conversations. One of the very first and foremost things that I love about our science is to understand how special our planet is and how special it is as a place we call home. We live literally on the only planet in our solar system that has or is habitable, has life on it. That habitable zone is really a unique thing in a lot of solar systems. And it doesn't just happen to be as a result of the distance from the sun. Yes, that's a big piece of it, a planet's distance from the sun. But a lot of it also has to do with the thickness of the planet's atmosphere and the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And I have here that, Venus and Mars, which are our neighboring planets, they have very similar sizes to us. Now, of course, Mars is a little bit smaller, but what we do know, and this image is not really representative size-wise, so don't get hung up on that, but what we do know is that their atmospheres are very different chemically from ours. One of the things that we do have in common is the carbon dioxide in our atmospheres. And we know that on Venus, that atmosphere is super thick. 96% of it is carbon dioxide, and you can see that the average temperature is really, really uninhabitable. We can't live there. It would be impossible. Mars, on the other hand, we are eyeballing as a potential place for habitation and thinking about ways that life might exist there. What we know about Mars is that most of the carbon dioxide on that planet is stored in the ground right now. And so they have a really thin atmosphere. As a result, their heat trapping capacity of the atmosphere is diminished. And so they have a really cold daily temperature planet. We're really special on the planet Earth in that our atmosphere and our position from the sun, distance from the sun, has allowed civilization to flourish on our planet and for humans to really evolve along with many other life forms. So again, first and foremost, scientific principle is to understand that our Earth is like that's it. This is where life is in our known solar system right now. And we need to protect that. We need to understand it and we need to protect it. One of the other science things that I like to make sure that people have an understanding of is the difference between weather and climate. We see politicians throwing snowballs on the floor of the House and Senate, and we know that they're talking about weather when they do that, but they're also trying to make the connection to climate change. So understanding the difference between weather and climate is a really important distinction scientifically. So I'm going to ask the audience again, is there anyone out there who very briefly in the chat box would like to say what the difference between weather and climate is? What do we know?
Claire would like to say that weather is time dependent and climate is long term.
Okay, Claire is onto something.
Charlotte says that climate is overarching and broad. Joshua, weather is what's outside right now, climate, long-term trends and patterns.
Great. You guys are pretty smart already when it comes to the difference. Yeah, we see variability day to day in our weather, even hour to hour in our weather. So weather is really changing. But when we knit every moment of our weather together, and when we knit it day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, and we look at it over 30-year period, that's where we start to see our climate impacts and our climate view, what kind of climate we're looking at. And someone recently said that it's like walking a dog, whereas you don't know where the dog is going to go. So the dog is kind of like the weather, but the guy who's walking the dog on a graph, he would be the one who would be more representative of climate in that respect. And I really love a good metaphor. So, kind of seeing how a dog walking is variable, but that the man walking the dog is kind of on a trend, right? When we talk to little kids about climate change, and we do, one of the things we do to distinguish that weather versus climate idea is that, weather is what when you look out your window and you see what kind of a day it is today, you are dressed for that, you dress for that day. So weather's really what you wear day to day, but climate's what's in your closet, right? Climate is your winter clothes and your summer flip-flops and your raincoat and all of the things together in your closet. It's the whole year and more of weather. So with little kids, we make that kind of a metaphor. It's what's in your closet versus what you're wearing today. Weather is what you look out the window and see. So that's a really interesting and fun distinction scientifically. One of the other ways that we like to think scientifically about climate is the difference between global warming and climate change. And just for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and stick this up here. We do use the term global warming, and it was used more so back in the early 2000s than the term climate change. But what we learned over these years is that global warming is just one aspect of a changing climate. And so that unified temperature increase of Earth's average surface temperature is the thing that's really driving some of the bigger, broader aspects of a changing climate. So seeing them connected is important, but knowing the distinction is also important. Climate change also refers to some of the changes in precipitation as well. And it's not equal. Even though the globe is warming, the average surface temperature is increasing. All things aren't heating up equally around the planet. Does anybody know where the most rapid increase in temperature is happening right now? It's kind of concerning. I'll ask for the chat box.
Everybody's at the poles.
At the poles, that's right. That's considered Earth's air conditioning system, right? It regulates the cycles of cool air on our planet, and a lot of other things. So beyond weather versus climate, global warming versus climate change, the fact that we live on a really special planet, special due to its atmosphere, largely, understanding the mechanism of climate change is another scientific idea. And it's because of that excess carbon dioxide that man is burning and putting out into the atmosphere. And I'll get into a slide in a little bit. So understanding the mechanism, that it's us, again, is really an important scientific piece. All right, so how do we know that the Earth is warming? Oh, excuse me. And sorry about that. I don't know what just happened, but I just lost my whole screen. Let me just see if I can pull it back in here. Pardon me. Can you guys all see all this craziness that just popped up?
Nope. We just see your slides.
You just see my slides. Awesome, because I don't even see my slides right now. Okay, there I am. I'm back. Yay. Okay. That was embarrassing. All right. So how do we know? So again, simplifying things for meaning and for having productive conversations. NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and even NASA have come up with these 10 indicators of a warming world. And these are things that you can familiarize yourself with because it's just 10 simple things. We're seeing decreases in 3 areas: glaciers, snow cover, and sea ice. And we're seeing increases in 7 areas. So a lot of those are over temperature, ocean heat content, near surface temperature of the air, temperature over land, and the in abundance of water vapor, which is one of our greenhouse gases in our atmosphere is water vapor. So we're seeing increases in 7 areas and decreases in 3. And, you know, these are kind of important to keep your finger on the pulse of the planet and looking at. We also know that we're seeing anomalies in temperature. So this is a really fun infographic of temperature anomalies, so differences in temperature by 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. And so looking at the years of temperature data that we have for different countries around the globe, someone has put together these little bubbles of, well, is it staying neutral, or is it going down 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, or is it increasing 1 or 2 degrees Celsius in these various countries? And over time, you can see when those areas of temperature are represented, that warming is pretty obvious, right? And it's pretty obvious all over. What I love about that graphic is that someone, Edward Menke, I think his name is, created these beautiful color graphs that went along with temperature. And he created what we call warming stripes. So he looked at a graph of data, he gave it in a color attribution for a point on the graph, and you can see what that looks like when you put the X and Y axis, the time versus temperature anomaly difference there on either end. But when you take the science away from it and you just have the color that's there represented, it doesn't really get as confusing, right? To try and make sense of some of the science that's there. You can actually pretty clearly see something is happening at the right end of the color graph. And it's pretty impressive. Why I love this as a resource for talking about climate change is because it gives you some options. And yeah, Ed Hawkins, so is the scientist who created this, the climate graphs, or the climate stripes, warming stripes. And people around the country who do have a platform, who do use their voice as their superpower, have started to wear these stripes or show them and use them as starters, conversation starters. So here's a meteorologist who had a tie made out of the warming stripes, and he got to talk about it during his discussion on the weather. So we have here's a city in Germany, and they were reminding folks to use public transportation and use the climate stripes from their own city. You can actually go and do this online, look at your own city to see how dramatic the stripes are or not in your own areas. Here's a gentleman who's reminding all of us by wrapping his Tesla in climate stripes to say it's important that we start to transition to net zero living, right? So it's kind of cool the way that people are using this. Even women in yoga classes have the opportunity to have these conversations by what they wear. So back to the science really quickly. How do we know it's us? I'm going to talk really briefly about these ice cores. We know that up in Greenland and in Antarctica, scientists are able to collect ice cores. And they're really beautiful because each one of those lines that you see in the ice core sample there is actually a time capsule from a year in Earth's history. And some of those time capsules can go back pretty far. In Greenland, the samples go back 125,000 years. And in Antarctic, they go back 400,000 years. So we get inside those compressed areas of ice and snow that once were at the surface, we see air bubbles, which are full of carbon dioxide and other natural gases that were in Earth's air and atmosphere at that time. And we can actually look down to an isotopic level to see the makeup of carbon dioxide. And why I bring up isotopes and that isotopic level is because there's really a fingerprint on carbon dioxide. And when we look at carbon, carbon can be carbon 12, 13, 14. And we've heard about carbon 14 with carbon dating and how important that is and how, understanding how old things are. And what we know is that, carbon dioxide really, carbon from natural sources has a lot of carbon 14, but when we burn carbon, when we incinerate it or use up the energy that's stored in it, that isotope is lost, that carbon 14. So when we look at ice cores, we can see that there was an abundant amount of carbon 14 in the carbon dioxide molecules that are there. When we look at today's atmosphere, we see mostly carbon-12 and carbon-13 and almost no carbon-14 naturally coming out, because most of the carbon in our atmosphere today is due to the burning of fossil fuels. So it's really an imposing fingerprint of human activity and just looking at that. And I understand that's pretty sciencey, so I encourage you to do a little more research on this topic and to understand it a little bit better. So, you know, arming yourself with how that looks. This is the data that was compiled over years of looking at these ice cores to see how we've been pretty stable for about 400,000 years. We've not really changed much. There's been fluctuation, but it hasn't been as rapid of a change as we've seen since 1950. And right in the middle of the industrial age, about 50 years or so after we started really burning fossil fuels, we started to see that abundance of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. These are parts per million levels. Does anybody know what the parts per million we're at today are? Anybody want to take a guess? On this particular one, I think this data is from 2018, and I think it looks like we're at about 400 parts per million on here. Does anybody know where we are now?
We have Charlotte saying 450, Jack Person 52.
I think today we're at 411 or 412. And it does fluctuate from season to season. So when the growing season in the northern hemisphere is happening, we do see a decrease in carbon dioxide because, of course, plants utilize it in photosynthesis. Yeah, 411 or 412 is the last time I looked. And does anybody know what the actual number we would like to get to through the use of renewables? Where would we like to be more stable? Anybody know?
Joshua says 360, Charlotte 350.
350. Charlotte's got it. Yeah. Bill McKibben, who's been a climate scientist and activist for years, has an organization called 350.org. And that term actually comes from that number, which is the target carbon dioxide reduction we're all trying to get to. So 350.org. We have some work to do. I'm going to go through these slides really, really quickly because I know that I'm kind of running out of time and I want to get to the communication pieces. This is a little bit of the science, and because a lot of us live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, I just want to explain some of the impacts that we're seeing from some of the data that comes out of my research reserve in the Chesapeake Bay. We did a study a few years ago to look at some sensitivity of the Chesapeake around 4 parameters. So 4 of those parameters were a growing season length and the frost days, warm tropical nights, and precipitation. And what we found was kind of interesting. We did some data analysis of 30 years of data, both in Virginia and Maryland, and we applied the trends that we were seeing to a 100-year proxy data on regional temperature, precipitation data. And so what we found is that the growing season in our region is about 30 days longer today than it was 100 years ago. We also found that we have 30 fewer frost days than we did 100 years ago. So our winter is essentially 60 days shorter than it was 100 years ago, which has some implications if you're a naturalist or a scientist or someone who manages for our natural resources, understanding how that is impacting things like phenology and the seasons and cycling of things, migration or spawning, or those things are really important. If you're a farmer, understanding how much more growing season you have is really important versus also, whether or not you're going to have certain agricultural pests die off in the wintertime. One of the indexes that I think is really relevant and important is the Warm Tropical Nights Index. And this is a threshold. It's the number of days in a year where the minimum temperature actually doesn't dip below 68 degrees. And so looking back over 100 years of data on this, here in the Chesapeake Bay area, we've actually are experiencing 30 more days. So it's 30 days of growing season, 30 fewer of frost, and 30 more of warm tropical nights than we had 100 years ago. The reason why this index is important is because it's an indicator of stress, humans as well as ecosystems. So at night, if you imagine when the temperature doesn't go below a certain temperature threshold, whatever stress was caused by the heat of the day, it doesn't really have a chance ecosystems to kind of recover during the night when that happens. And so we have this constant like low level of stress for 30 additional days on our ecosystems, as well as our human beings. I don't know about you, but I don't sleep well at night if my thermostat isn't around 73 degrees or so. And I get a little cranky and angry the next day. Total precipitation is also increased. We're seeing a 12% increase over these 100 years. That's about 4.5 more inches of rain per year than we did a century ago. And what this means is more fresh water into the Chesapeake Bay. I know a lot of us are aware of how the rain has changed. We're not seeing nice long shower days. We're seeing big microbursts of rain where we get flood watches more and more. And so those types of freshwater impulses into the Chesapeake can be problematic for spawning fish or germinating SAV. It can also be problematic for what runs off the land and into our waterways. So things like nitrogen and phosphorus that cause algal blooms to happen. And so in looking at those 4 models and those indices, we can kind of get a sense of what we're facing if the trend continues towards a healthy versus an unhealthy Chesapeake Bay or any waterway that you're probably nearby in this mid-Atlantic region. But don't fret. Again, I'm going to remind you, you guys are all superheroes and you're able to have productive conversations. I want to remind you that you are a trusted messenger and your voice is your superpower. And I want to just kind of give you a sense of some of these ways that we can have more meaningful conversations. So we all have sticky messages that kind of stick with us for our lives. Sometimes you've heard a grandmother say like a stitch in time saves 9, and then other ones. I'll give you some examples, some clues here. Does anybody know who this guy is and what his sticky message was? Do we have any, I always do this and I'm always worried my generation is going to show here.
Give a hoot, don't pollute.
That's right, Woodsy Owl, give a hoot, don't pollute. Very good. All right, how about this guy?
I see people typing. Smokey.
Smokey the Bear, that's right. His sticky message was, only you can prevent forest fires, right? And then there's this one. Does anybody know what this one is? And if you can, type it into the chat, what the golden rule says, why it's sticky.
I see people typing in. Charlotte says, do unto others. Jack person too.
Yes, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? And this is, every religion on earth actually has this sticky message somewhere embedded in it, and which is why it's called the golden rule, because it's everywhere. It's not just with one particular culture or ideology, it's kind of universal. So yeah, so you treat others the way you want to be treated, ultimately, is what it comes down to. So we're going to talk about the power of a sticky message. And we're going to talk about tone and how important our tone is. A few years ago, we had the Winter Olympics. During the Winter Olympics, there was this fantastic ad by Subaru, and it was devastating. It was kind of demonstrating the safety of a Subaru. It showed an accident scene and a tow truck coming to pick up the car from the accident scene. And the tow truck driver looked at it and he shook his head and he was in disbelief. And he looked at the police officer, and the only words in the entire ad are the police officer saying, they lived. 2 words. That's it. Sticky message, no crisis tone, they lived. And in those 2 powerful sticky words, you got the sense that that was a really safe car. Okay. And the ad goes on and the tow truck driver goes back and he says they live to someone else and that person says they live to someone else. Everybody who gets in contact with this car has those two words. So it's reinforced, it's said often, as sticky messages should be, but the point is clear and there's no crisis tone involved. What we say, how we say it, are important. And one of the most critical things I've learned about having conversations around climate is that we need to connect with our fellow citizens. So whether you're having a conversation with your neighbor next door, your family member at Thanksgiving, find the values that you all can connect on and start there. So we're going to be talking right now for the next few minutes about how we need to change the story that we're telling. And there's three elemental pieces. Where we learned these pieces, or where I learned these pieces, was going through a cohort of training done with the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation. Basically, hundreds of zoos and aquariums around the country got together and said, we need to unify our voice so that when individuals who care about conservation, who come to our zoos, who come to our aquariums because they love animals and they love our ecosystems that are represented in our places of science, we need to be saying the same thing when these individuals come here. So what does that sound like? And how can we still tell the story of, a kookaburra versus a jellyfish exhibit versus, a tiger? How do we tell those stories of our conservation work, but also weave in climate communication? Because we have a huge audience. 61% of the US population visits these places. They got together and they worked with some social scientists and they worked with some organizations that know how to frame messages based on social science. And they came up with this formula that will help us not worry about climate change. You can have the human brain and the human brain thinking about climate change, and it can be awful. And the reason that it can be awful is because oftentimes when we don't understand fully a topic, we fill in the gaps in our knowledge with what we can make sense of, right? We use cultural models, as they say. So things that help us sort of connect the dots on our own way. But unfortunately, sometimes those cultural models that we use to patch the hole in the gap in our knowledge aren't always good connectors. And I like this slide because the man says while he's watching TV, why don't the greenhouse gases escape through the hole in the ozone layer? And that just kind of gets to that idea that maybe our understanding of how the climate system works is getting clouded by our understanding of what's going on with the ozone layer. And they're all up there, but they're not as connected as one would think. So in trying to avoid that type of thinking and having to know more than you probably should to be able to have productive conversations, the Noki network came up with a core story of climate change to be able to talk about this. And the structure is basically, why does it matter to society? So establishing what the values are to people, what's at stake. How does it work, which is that mechanism of climate change that we talked about earlier, that it's us, right? And it's the burning of fossil fuels. But then to finalize it and talk about it, like, how do we improve the situation? So what are the hopeful messages around solutions that help us understand? Okay, so values establish things, sticky messages and metaphors help us make it work, and solutions are what we should all be talking about more so than anything. I'm going to go through these pretty quick because I see we're at 151 here and I still have quite a few slides go. So values, again, they help us establish what's at stake. They also can encompass a whole broad group of cultural ideas. And they really do lead us to the type of thinking in thinking about solutions. So again, when we did this research through the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, we found the two values that matter to the broadest number of people in a particular audience that might go to a zoo, an aquarium, or a place like the Audubon Naturalist Society. They were protection and responsible management. So if you can have a conversation and start it from a place of protection, or start it from a conversation around responsible management of something, you're likely to connect with people on values that are shared. Very quickly, when we think about responsible management, there are some elements to it. So being responsible when it comes to our life support system, the environment, thinking ahead to handle problems before they get worse, kind of common sense stuff. And then, knowing that as a trusted messenger, people who are responsible managers of anything keep an open mind. They tend to use science or evidence, and they take a level-headed approach to thinking about how to manage for something. And also responsible management, it gives a nod to future generations, right? So for Americans and for humans in general, it's really hard for us to see way far ahead into the future, or to even consider or contemplate the impacts that what we do today have on future generations. But in coming at it from a responsible management value, this is already sort of baked in. From protection, people protect what they love. Jacques Cousteau said that, and this is a really important distinction. So we not only protect what we love, but oftentimes we need to remember to protect what we depend on, those ecosystems. We know that protecting is the right thing to do to show concern for others. And we know that ensuring safety and well-being for people is really an incredible aspect of being a member of the global community. We also know that taking measures to reduce risks is another important aspect of protection. You know, it's so funny, as I'm reading these off and saying these, I'm thinking about like the whole coronavirus thing today and the idea of protecting one another. And boy, I'd love to know whether this value is still as important to social scientists as it was when this research was done, because it feels almost a little bit like it might not be that important as it once was. I'm gonna have to go back and check with my people there. But let's look at how important that those two values are when establishing a conversation. Also, using those sticky messages like the golden rule and those other ones, it helps to patch that hole in the head when we guess about the science. There were two metaphors that were used in our research. That was the heat trapping blanket metaphor, which establishes that beautiful "you're special" atmosphere on planet Earth that allows civilization to thrive and exist. And also the regular versus rampant carbon dioxide metaphor, which kind of establishes, yeah, there's a natural carbon cycle, but it's the burning of fossil fuels that's causing rampant carbon dioxide to get out of control. I'm going to really skip Serenella through these next couple of slides because they're wordy, and I'm going to get to what the metaphor actually says. So when we burn fossil fuels for energy, we add more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It builds up like a blanket that traps heat around the world, which disrupts the climate. So when we explain climate in our conversations and think about the heat trapping blanket and use that metaphor in our conversations, it helps us to strategically redirect thinking away from other patches that patch that hole, right, in our knowledge. So some folks will say, well, is it the ozone, or nature will fix itself, or climate, change is natural, so we shouldn't do anything about it anyway, and that nature works in cycles. These are okay ways to think. They're true in a lot of senses, but they don't help us move forward in figuring out solutions towards climate change. And they often get us down, contemplations around where they're true and where they're not. But for this purpose, if we just stick to a heat trapping blanket, and think about the burning of fossil fuels, adding more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and thickening that blanket, then it helps us to sort of get a visual picture of what that means. For regular versus rampant carbon dioxide as metaphors, regular carbon dioxide is used and created by normal life processes, but rampant carbon dioxide comes from burning fossil fuels for energy. We need to reduce rampant carbon dioxide. It's getting out of control. And again, you can see it strategically redirects thinking away from patterns like carbon dioxide is natural and therefore it's good, which is a true statement. Or the confusion in science around, is it carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide? And there's still some confusion at a science level there with a lot of Americans. So in using those terms regular versus rampant, it helps to kind of steer away from some of those ways that you can get stuck in a sticky conversation. So when we're having conversations, if we talk about whatever it is the issue we're talking about, Serenella, you might be talking about mushrooms and fungus and the beautiful world and microcosm of decomposers. But when we walk people through that particular issue and we want to talk about climate related to it, connecting some of that science to the solutions, and even explaining things using those metaphors and using values like protection and responsible management will really help to motivate productive considerations of solutions, which is the last part of our message, right? We want to make sure that when we do have conversations about climate change, we're not just talking about the impacts to organisms or ecosystems or our communities, or we're talking about the cause of it. We want to make sure that we leave talking about solutions so that there's that sense of agency. And there's a bazillion solutions out there right now. Ones that exist that you can point to in our neighborhoods, you know, from green infrastructure to, you know, public transportation, to city gardens, to, you know, solar panels, and even the way that we build our cities for less idling in cars. I'm going to really quickly share with you some resources if you're looking for great resources on solutions. This website, drawdown.org, fantastic. They are doing tons of research into what reduces carbon dioxide the fastest and through different sectors. So you can look at it from transportation or farming or health or industry and even oceans and the ocean's role in climate, and thinking about different ways that these different opportunities for solutions can be woven together. What's beautiful about it too is that they look at things from a local perspective and a global perspective. So it's not out of our reach. It can be local, but it can have global impacts as well. So it's a really great resource. It's drawdown.org. So remember, you know, because of these great resources and these solutions that we can talk about, but also some of this formula in understanding the role values play in our conversations, and also understanding how to explain the science in sticky ways, we're in a pretty good place, right? Also look to your state. And in my state in Maryland, we've got a really aggressive greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan, and we've got fact sheets kind of showing what Maryland is doing to mitigate, to reduce that greenhouse gas emission, but also how we're planning to adapt and respond to what we already know we're going to be facing in the future. And then also we have fact sheets around what the science is telling us and how the science is changing as we continue to burn fossil fuels, the science changes. And then also how are we educating and reaching out to citizens to let them know that we care about this and that we're working hard on it. So check with your state to find out what's going on in your state, and it helps you to say our leaders care and we're doing something about it, and it kind of informs you a little bit more. Okay, last couple slides. Great resources. These are some of my favorite. I know that Serenella is going to be sending out this PowerPoint presentation, so I think this is slide number like 70 or something. I'm sorry. But yeah, these are the great resources that I look to on a regular basis. This beautiful graphic, by the way, if you ever have insomnia and you are desperate to look at some nerdy data in a beautiful way, not saying that I ever do that, but there's a great website called earth.nullschool, Nullschool, earth.nullschool.net. And you can look at a variety of data, earth, wind temperature, surface temperature, ocean currents, and you can change the way your map looks. It's just a visual feast for your eyes if you're a data nerd. Global Weirding is a great resource. Catherine Hayhoe is one of the best climate communicators on the planet, and she has a great animated website, short videos, helping to debunk myths. If you're afraid of you know, being myth busted with family members, go check that out. It's really entertaining and wonderful. Also, the Cranky Uncle book, another great way to bust myths. And then also take a peek at the resources, the Eco America, the Yale climate maps. All of those are wonderful. And if you liked some of the strategic framing, the Noki messaging, the values, solution, metaphors, and solutions, there are full one-day trainings that you can do online at climateinterpreter.org. All right. Reminding you, we're in a good place. You're a trusted messenger. You don't have to be a scientist. You just got to reframe the story to make it memorable and productive. Talk about solutions, that there's great resources out there, and that you probably live in an area that is more of a leader than you know. So if all else fails, it's real, it's us. Experts agree, it's bad, but there's hope, right? 10 words. And again, reminding folks, the future is ours to create, right? Let's start by having conversations about that future and what we want it to look like. All right, questions? Do we have time?
Awesome, Coreen. Thank you so much. It is 2 o'clock now, and I want to be respectful to everybody's time. So if you have to run, I understand. Thank you for your support today. If you would like to stay and ask questions, we will take advantage of Coreen as long as we can have her. And please use the chat box or your voice to ask those questions. We want you to use whatever is more comfortable for you. On that note, Coreen asks, who was the greatest science communicator?
Oh, her name, and she's a climate communicator. Her name is Catherine Hayhoe. Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Catherine Hayhoe. She's a climate scientist at a Texas university, and she is married to an evangelical Christian. So talking to his parishes about the work that she does was a challenge for her. And so she learned how to really be an effective climate communicator from that perspective. She's wonderful.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question, Coreen?
Of course.
Has this community taken a look at communication of, or not, of the pandemic for any lessons learned? Because certainly I could observe that denial is something that is really tough to crack, as we may have observed in alternate situations. And are there any lessons learned that the climate change community can take from that?
So Claire, great question. And yes, there is a lot of really great work that's going on right now to make correlations between, how we're responding to this pandemic, and to sort of learn a few lessons, maybe what is working in this rapid response or not, and also what we can apply down the road to addressing climate with a sense of urgency. So I know that there are a lot of related issues. I've seen issues related to justice around, the communities that are most impacted by COVID are often the ones that are most impacted by climate as well. So there's a whole bunch that we need to do as a civilization to kind of address equity issues and look at across not just the vulnerability of communities for health, but also for climate. So I think there's a lot going on right now that we're going to learn, in how we communicate about climate for productive purposes, for solutions-oriented purposes, but also, what are we doing wrong now with the pandemic, and what can we learn from it?
Yeah, that's going to be.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Because if I can follow on, if nobody else has any questions. So given that, yeah, I suspect you're correct that a lot of the places that are more hurt by the pandemic are also more hurt by climate change. Could that be used to better tell the story, so that if you find an audience that at least has some belief in, one of the following negative items that are occurring in the world today, if you can demonstrate the relationship, you might win over a few other people.
I agree, and yes, I think those stories are already emerging, and I'm definitely seeing them. What I've also found on my journey, though, and unfortunately, science only goes so far to sort of nudge us in the right direction to make better behavior choices. What I've been finding is that we need more art, and we need better storytellers, and we need more stories that compel us to want to change. We need to care more. Art engenders empathy, and we need more empathy in this whole issue. Science alone isn't going to save us. So, I think that we've had the science for decades and decades, knowing that our burning of fossil fuels would impact our atmosphere and warm our world. And it was science that was stifled, that people then, had doubt around for a variety of reasons, which there's a whole bunch of stories around that. I encourage you to investigate. But the bottom line is, if we can look at our own imaginations and see at the heart of things what this means to us as a human being, as a civilization, we really might be able to tap into a little bit more empathy. And, with COVID and with coronavirus and our response to that, and looking at those communities and telling similar stories, I mean, we need to see this as a moral issue, not as a political issue. And again, we're starting to see those divisions happening with COVID. COVID is a moral issue when it comes down to it, as much as it is scientific, like climate. and we politicize it, unfortunately. But yes, there are ways to look at this and to tell the story that are very similar on a parallel with what we're dealing with the pandemic.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said. I'm a scientist / engineer, and one of the barriers that we encounter is that we have some of our scientists who are looking at, let's say, measuring greenhouse gases. The science to measure a lot of the deleterious effects does not exist to the level that one could actually measure to say, well, I've decreased my carbon footprint by 20%. You really, and part of the problem with that is that it's hard to justify getting funding to actually have that learning. It becomes this endless cycle of, well, I don't know, therefore it doesn't exist. Well, I know it exists, but I can't completely measure it. And you kind of go back and forth, and that just sort of adds to the mix.
Yeah, I can feel that frustration, and I understand that's got to be crazy. I think maybe that there's some importance in thinking about selling the work that needs to be done. And I say selling because I can't think of a better word right now.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's the right word.
Maybe
it's a marketing situation, and too many scientists don't like to recognize that word.
Right, telling the story in a simplified way. It's hard with scientists because, science is so wonderfully full of wonder, right? Asking the questions, full of curiosity, big-brained, all those things. But the average American science literacy is 6th grade. And even people in leadership positions have an average science understanding.
Yeah, so, and that's another issue that we need to deal with separately. But yes, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, but being able to tell a story about the work that you do to someone who's 11 years old would be an easier sell, I think, whether you're telling it to someone who's 11 or not, but kind of coming from that. We say smartening it up in our world, like taking that science and making it meaningful to that level. So
yeah, it's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge. I actually think science communication is going to be one of the better careers in the next decade or so. That it's going to really blow up a bit in terms of, good careers to be in.
I agree with you. And, for my position as being on the scientist side of that, I can say that a lot of my peers, well, I'll be direct about it. A lot of them, they look down on science communication people because they don't have science degrees, and they don't like dumbing things down, which is what a lot of scientists will call it, even though, even though I completely agree with where you're coming from. And so some of the issue, I think it does go to equity and mutual respect. And again, that kind of also, it kind of parallels some of the issues we're having with COVID, that wearing a mask is a sign of mutual respect, I would argue, but many don't want to do that.
Right.
So,
which is where empathy is kind of required. Right. And the idea of it being something that's moral rather than political is also a new way to frame things too. So people are afraid to do that. They're afraid to care about one another, which is kind of a weird place to be.
Yeah.
You guys were wonderful. Thank you for sticking through. I think I had more slides than I probably needed, but thank you.
This was awesome. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, this was amazing. Thank you.